Hello everyone, my name is Brikitta Hairston, and I want to first start by saying that I'm not a brain science expert, even though we'll be talking about brain science today. I study criminal justice at the University of New Haven, and I focus on juvenile crime and violent crime in juveniles. So before we get into the talk, I just want to go over a few definitions. The first one is recidivism, which is the concept behind someone who has committed a criminal act and received punishment for it or has done time for their crime, yet reoffends in the future. While deterrence is the concept behind reducing juvenile crime or reducing criminal acts by introducing alternative methods rather than probation or parole. And one of those methods is cognitive behavioral therapy. This method can reduce criminal behavior and reduce recidivism, which in turn will reduce crime in the future. So I want to have you guys imagine an 8-year-old on a bus after school with a crowd of other kids, and then I want you to imagine 2 police officers standing behind this child, and I want to leave you with that image while we get into this talk. First, we need to understand that juvenile brains are not fully developed, so punishing them for decisions that they essentially did not fully understand is a cruel and unusual punishment. So restorative programs have determined that deterrence can be reached by using discipline and skill-building approaches as the most important program goals, because these efforts can be easier traced in research trials and sanctioned research spaces where the results are easier tracked and replicated. And to be replicable means that the findings of the research study are essentially able to be repeated in the outside world and not just where you can trace the results in a controlled research environment. Now, Mark Lipsey from Vanderbilt University conducted his own analysis of 548 studies, starting in 1958 and continuing to 2002. He evaluated proponents of preventative methods and found that cognitive behavioral therapy programs and their policies were far more effective than any other intervention, such as probation, punitive methods, or community parole. And following that, another study was done starting in 1965 and ending in 2005, and those findings also agreed that cognitive behavioral therapy was effective even when juvenile offenders were already undergoing punitive sentences. So this means that cognitive behavioral therapy can be introduced at any time. Even though it is an early preventative method, it's not too late to introduce an alternative to a punitive method of punishment. The only way to answer whether or not cognitive behavioral therapy is effective on a larger scale is to introduce massive research studies where cognitive behavioral therapy is used at the onset of a juvenile offender's career. There are select government policies and programs who have already recognized this truth and funded programs such as aggression replacement therapy, which uses the cognitive behavioral therapy protocols to help juveniles understand how they make their decisions, how they use their thoughts and emotions to behave. Because essentially thoughts and behaviors and emotions all go hand in hand. And most importantly is, what kind of offenders would this be effective with? Is it only petty crimes? Can this be effective for violent crimes that are of a concern to society? And the answer is that high-risk offenders actually serve as a prime example of how cognitive behavioral therapy can mold the juvenile brain while it's still developing and introduce alternatives to violence or indeterminate behavior that juveniles easier fall prey to. And one of the reasons that juveniles so easily engage in criminal behavior or petty crimes is because Social crime theories have determined that things such as peer pressure greatly affect the decisions of children. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy can help them work through those emotions rather than internalizing them or easier falling prey to the thoughts of others and the behaviors of others. Now, the research studies and the trials, they can only take us so far. And the criminal justice system and the important decision makers and policymakers need to see these practices in use. They need to understand that the juvenile brain is not as developed as an adult brain. They need to understand that instead of punishing them for a crime done at one moment in time, they should instead be counseled and helped through their emotions and their thoughts, what they're going through, how to ensure that if they go through it again, will this same thing happen whether or not they're put in prison. So overhauling the current practices in place immediately is essentially not the way to go. But considering these cognitive behavioral therapy methods can lead us toward an easier, acceptable criminal justice system, because deterring juvenile crime is an ongoing process. It requires the right infrastructure and the right oversight and the right people making it work. So it won't always be the judge or the jury. Sometimes it has to start with the police officer called to the scene, or the school teacher who is reporting suspicious behavior at school, or even parents at home. And back to the aggression replacement therapy, that is one of the leading protocols because it is backed by the research trials that have delivered those replicable results. And one of them was seen in Graham versus Florida. Now, this case was about a 16-year-old boy who had shoplifted and was sentenced to juvenile detention. And while out on parole, he reoffended and was sentenced to life in prison. His case was appealed, and the state of Florida decided that to give a juvenile a life sentence for behaviors that he may not have understood or been fully developed enough to control is a cruel and unusual punishment. And that is something that needs to be seen more often. We need the people who are on the ground to understand that there are other ways, there are other methods to deterring crime, rather than engaging a juvenile whose brain is still developing in a very violent prison system, who can essentially mold their behavior in the future to become more violent, rather than preventing violence in the future. These preventative approaches to deterring juvenile crime will be the start of a reformed criminal justice system where punishment is not always the answer. Because we need to understand that the juvenile brain is very limited, and in those limitations is the key to how to deter crime by understanding how they commit crime, and it will reduce the inundation of adult offenders and the overcrowding of jails and prisons and the surplus of citizens on parole and probation whose lives were essentially halted after one decision changed everything for them. And there's another way to explain this, and it's called labeling. A short definition of that is when someone commits an act, in this case a crime, to say that because they did a bad thing, they are a bad person, or in turn a criminal, is what labeling is. So labeling a child who committed a crime as a criminal decides how their future will develop. So lastly, I want to go back to that image of the 8-year-old and the 2 police officers that we started with. And those officers had a decision in that moment of what they could do after being called by a bus driver to the scene and being told that that 8-year-old had struck another kid on the bus. And having no idea of any backstory or why it happened, instead of the police officer going through a booking or taking her to the police station or something more punitive, the police officer decided to take her home to her parents. And while that's not cognitive behavioral therapy, it is an alternative method to intervening in crime committed by children. And it is a way to offer them an alternative to entering them into a system that will essentially change how they develop in the future. And if you hadn't figured it out already, that 8-year-old was me. And it was probably the start of my life in the criminal justice system, but luckily, because of that decision, I'm on the outside of it and not on the inside. So lastly, today's juvenile delinquents would be tomorrow's adult offenders if we don't intervene, if we don't offer them an alternative to understanding why they're doing what they're doing, helping them through their thoughts, through their emotions, and changing their behaviors. By doing that, by educating them and counseling them, we will improve the future of the American criminal justice system.